I'm pleased to be joined today by the U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin. Thank you for being here, Mr. Secretary.
My pleasure. Great to be here with you.
We've reached you amidst an ongoing global pandemic during a period of historic social unrest, just 4.5 months before a presidential election. So we've got plenty to cover here. You said about a week and a half ago that you really couldn't see a second shutdown of the U.S. economy, but now we're starting to see COVID cases spike sharply in California and Texas and Florida, in 22 states total. Do you stand by your assessment?
I do, but let me just step back for a minute and first say, I think that the unprecedented response that the administration had working with the Senate and the House has had just a major impact on the economy. And us being able to put over $3 trillion in fiscal response and working with the Fed is really, really having a meaningful impact. And I think closing the economy was the right thing to do at the time. Our big concern was hospitals were full. We didn't have enough ventilators. We didn't have enough drugs. Dramatically different situation now. And yes, the number of cases have gone up. But when you look at our preparation in terms of hospitals, ventilators, and viral, and what we know about this, the death rates have gone down significantly. Now, obviously, we don't want any deaths, but this completely different situation.
So one of the reasons why it's different right now is that we have a ramped up testing program, which we didn't have until well into April. The president suggested over the weekend, just the day before yesterday, that he wanted to slow that down. If we do that, can you imagine the situation changing significantly?
Well, I think the president clearly said that in jest in a rally when he was talking about the numbers. In no way is it the president's policy or our policy to slow down testing. Matter of fact, we've tested over 20 million people. And another big difference, we have a ton of testing capacity now. And I think one of the reasons why we feel much better about reopening the economy is in many businesses, you can test people in scale. And to the extent that people have the virus, you can then contract trace and have them stay home.
So I want to switch to the economy, which you mentioned. There was a rapid response by the administration, by Congress, to pour somewhere in the realm of $3.3 trillion into the economy to prop it up. The Federal Reserve's projections a couple weeks ago were still pretty grim. They indicated they thought the unemployment rate would be at 9.3% at the end of 2020 and really not improve dramatically very quickly. Are you talking with the president? Are you talking with members of Congress about a second big stimulus package?
We are. We'd call this CARES 4.0. So we've done what we refer to as 3.5 of these. The last one was a half a deal, which extended the PPP and also had more money into hospitals. So we do anticipate there'll be a need for more fiscal response, and we'll be doing that in July. Now, let me just make the comment on the Fed, and I think I speak to Chair Powell almost every day, and we work very, very closely together. So this is nothing against the Fed, but traditional economic models are not very predictive in this scenario. And the reason why I say that is this is not a normal economic scenario. We closed the economy overnight, and we've reopened the economy. And I think, many people were surprised at the unemployment numbers. People were expecting we'd lose another 8 million jobs. We gained over 2.5 million jobs. But the president's job and my job will not be done until we get every single person back to work that lost their job because of this.
So I want to get more into the stimulus stuff, but before we do, I wanted to touch on just the mass demonstrations we're seeing in the streets right now, in the Black Lives Matter movement. Lots of economists have tied the fight for racial justice with a fight for economic justice. Race and poverty are, of course, linked in our country. Black Americans are twice as likely to be unemployed. That goes for now and at other times, and have about 1/10 as much wealth. What role do you think the U.S. government has in addressing this economic inequality?
Well, let me just first comment on peaceful demonstrations are one thing, and people have a right to do peaceful demonstrations. The rioting and looting that went on, there was just no excuse for that, and people shouldn't confuse the two issues. We always can do a better job on the issues that we're talking about. In terms of black unemployment, we had the lowest level of black unemployment under President Trump, and that's something we're very focused on. And we want to make sure that everyone has opportunities. This is not just about Black Lives Matter. This is about all people that don't have access to education and similar opportunities, and that there is no discrimination against any type of people.
So specifically with the stimulus, I mean, when you pour that amount of money, I mean, some of them are tax breaks and other things, but $3.3 trillion into the economy is pulling levers. It's no longer a totally free market when you have that amount of federal money dumped into it. And, these programs are choosing who they go to. They're choosing the avenues. What role do such a huge outlays of federal money have in mitigating the wealth gap, focusing on the people who need it the most?
Well, let me say at Treasury, we take great responsibility in the funds that have been entrusted to us by Congress. And we're very proud of the fact that in the Senate, the last two bills were 96-0 and 100-0. So this is really bipartisan, both the Republicans and the Democrats coming together to make this work in unprecedented times. Most of the programs are very broad-based programs. We didn't have the ability to choose who should get it. And part of that was for the reason that we needed to get money into the economy very quickly. As I said, programs that were going to take 4 or 5 months were not going to do any good. So if you look at the broad-based programs that we had, which was the economic impact payments, we sent out over 150 million payments in direct deposits in extraordinarily quick time. We worked with the states for enhanced unemployment benefits. And we set up within 2 weeks the payment protection plan, working with banks, getting out over $500 billion that impacted 50 million jobs. On top of that, we've now set up many, many facilities with the Federal Reserve. Again, these facilities don't pick winners and losers. They're broad-based facilities. There was some specific facilities in the case of the airlines industry that was a very unique situation, and there we did negotiate specific agreements between the Treasury and the airlines.
Oh, I meant more the way that the programs are designed. Some of the, buying old corporate stock, buying corporate debt, tends to benefit, if it's rolled out the way the Fed has it designed, will tend to benefit, the Walmarts and the AbbVie's over, other corporations. So there are decisions that are made in the way that these programs are structured and designed.
Well, we've been instrumentally involved in the way those, and I would push back on you on that, in that the way they're designed is they impacted every single one of the capital markets. So the first ones we started with were commercial paper and money market. This was in many cases where hardworking Americans had their savings in these money markets, and we wanted to make sure they had access to it. We then, as you said, did roll out to the corporate bond markets, which is one of the most important markets. But let me just say, without putting a penny of taxpayer money, the corporate bond markets unlocked. In the case of Boeing, they were able to borrow $25 billion without costing a taxpayer a penny. And that was an example where Congress had allocated to us national security money that we thought we'd need to use. So I would just say these are very broad-based. We also have things that impact auto loans, all different types of asset-backed. So it was both corporate and it was consumer, and now the Main Street mid-market businesses.
So one of the mandates of these programs that you're discussing now was getting back to full employment, as you mentioned before. And one of the criticisms that the Treasury has received from the Oversight Committee and other oversight committees is that there are almost no requirements on loan recipients to keep their employees on payroll. There's nothing in the big corporate bond programs that address it, and the Main Street lending program. companies that receive loans only have to make commercially reasonable efforts, good faith efforts. Why design it that way?
Sure. Well, let me just say that different programs had different purposes. Again, in the case of the Paycheck Protection Program, that was money that was required to rehire or retain people. That was originally 75% of the money. Congress decided to change that to 60% to allow more money for overhead. So that was clearly designed. We also had a retention tax credit that was specifically designed to retain people. In the case of the Fed facilities, and let me just say, these are done under Section 13.3 of the Federal Reserve Act, we agreed with Congress to unprecedented transparency. Every single one of those loans will be disclosed to Congress and the public. But these issues were very specifically discussed across Democrats and Republicans. And these are facilities that impact securities markets. And again, in other cases, we did have restrictions on dividends. We did have restrictions on executive compensation. But these were all discussions that were discussed very clearly on a bipartisan basis.
So you mentioned transparency there. I think that's a really important point. You released a statement on Friday saying that the Treasury had reached a new transparency deal. Instead of releasing no information about the recipients of the PPP loans, the Paycheck Protection Program loans, Treasury will now release some of that information. But under this new deal, we still don't have the names of 86% of the companies that received loans. How is that anywhere near the full transparency that was promised us?
Well, again, each one of these programs, we negotiated different things on full transparency. Again, this was a program that we never agreed to full transparency. And the reason for that is the loan amount is based upon the amount of salary. So no different than in the case of enhanced unemployment. I haven't heard anybody in Congress say, oh, we want to see the name of every single person who's received enhanced unemployment. What I wanted to make sure was that for the very small businesses, and in this case, we agreed to businesses that had payroll of 150,000 and less, that we would not disclose the loan amount and the company name, because if you did that, you would be able to tell people's compensation, and we didn't think that was fair. So for about 75% of the funds, we will put them in buckets. Again, we didn't think for transparency you needed to know, it was 6,250,000, so they'll be in buckets. The largest is 5 to 10 million. And I'm very pleased. I think this is the right balance between having transparency where the majority of the money went and protecting small businesses and sole proprietors on their own information. And again, I'm pleased we reached this agreement with both the Democrat and Republican leadership of the Small Business Committee.
Right, and I don't want to get too much in the weeds here, but this has been a flashpoint for many government watchdogs lately. Under normal circumstances, the Small Business Administration gives out federally backed loans. That's what they do. And under those programs, the standard operating procedure is that information, individual loan data, is released. So
that is correct. And in the 7A program, which is the typical SBA program, and in disaster loans today, the SBA will be releasing that information. As I said, in the case of the Paycheck Protection Plan, the idea here was that every single person who got retained on the Paycheck Protection Plan was $1 less we were spending on unemployment. So the idea here was to retain over 50 million people. So I would just say I think we've reached the right balance. Everybody seems to be happy. And by the way, as it relates to oversight committees that keep information confidential, they'll have access to more information. We are very much in favor of making sure that Congress is very clear in how we're distributing this money.
So I think one of the reasons that people are concerned about this has been, this is an unprecedented administration in many ways, but one is that we have a businessman who is our president right now, and many of his family members are still involved in that business. So can you ensure the American people that none of the 4 million companies whose names we don't know, we aren't allowed to know, have ties to the Trump administration, officials, members of Congress, through ownership stakes or stock holdings? How do we know that information?
Well, first of all, I think George Washington was a business person as well, if I recall. Okay, so this may not be the first president, but let me just say what we agreed to is the president and the vice president and members of the cabinet have the same restrictions that the House and Senate have. So we all agreed to the same identical provisions here. And yes, I can assure you that we are all subject to 100% of the same restrictions.
Does that include advisors to the president, like Jared Kushner?
Yes, it does. Well, I believe it's not all advisors, but I believe it refers to children and in-laws. And again, that's the same exact requirements that the House and the Senate agreed to.
So a slightly different topic here, but headlines have been rolling in quickly. I want to ask you about former Trump National Security Advisor John Bolton's book, which you referred to as full of lies and factual inaccuracies last week. In the book, Bolton mocks you for taking a pretty mainstream economic stance. He says you were worried that President Trump's tendency to liberally use sanctions would weaken their effect over time, which is held by a lot of economists. So is that in fact your position?
Well, let me first comment on the book, and I'm not going to comment on specifics because one of the things I did say in my statement is I think it's completely inappropriate that a national security advisor would repeat statements, whether they were true or not true, would repeat statements from a National Security Council meeting, principals meeting in the Situation Room, that by definition, everything is classified that's said there. He's also made comments about meetings with foreign leaders, which by definition are classified. But let me be clear, I was in the room with President Trump and President Xi. The conversation, the way John Bolton describes it, did not occur. And there are many other factual inaccuracies in the book. As it relates to sanctions, having nothing to do with the book, I will comment on my view on sanctions. They're a very, very important tool. I meet regularly with Mike Pompeo, with the Secretary of Defense, with the Director of the CIA. We regularly coordinate what is the national security strategy. And sanctions are a very important tool. Having said that, we are the reserve currency of the world. The reason why sanctions are such an important tool is because we have what's called primary and secondary. I think, as you know, in the case of Iran, the Europeans were very unhappy, but we did put secondary sanctions on them. We did that because we thought that the risk of a nuclear Iran was something that we weren't going to allow for. We've done more sanctions under this administration than the previous administrations combined. So for John Bolton to make the comment that Treasury did not execute sanctions or didn't use them properly, again, is inappropriate. Everything we did in coordination with state, and when there were disagreements, we went to the President of the United States.
Right. I think the issue is not that the Trump administration has not used sanctions a lot. Trump has made more than 1,000 designations in the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, which administers the sanctions, more than double his predecessors. So I think the issue, and what Bolton mentions in the book, is that you were pushing back that there were perhaps too many sanctions. I see your point about not relaying conversations with the president. So I'll parlay that into a different question, which is, if we go too far, we lose our power abroad. That's essentially the problem. And with the trade war, we're starting to see that. In the months after the trade war ended with China, it's becoming clear that a lot of the markets are not going to bounce back as they once had, in part because, the world moves on. It finds ways to evade our sanctions and our demands. Brazil's share of China's soybean market rose to 76% in 2018 and another 65% last year. The soybean market in America probably won't recover because they found a way around it. Was that a concern for you as a key economic advisor to the president?
Well, first, let me just again comment on the sanctions, because I think this is very important. And, Bolton's comments and complaints where we weren't doing enough sanctions. And again, I would just reiterate, we use sanctions very appropriately and very harshly in many, many ways. Now, as it relates to economic issues and soybeans, quite frankly, I probably know a lot more about soybeans than I ever thought I'd know, since soybeans is an important agriculture product for us. I think, as part of the China trade deal, they did agree that they were going to have massive increases in U.S. agriculture and in particular soybeans. And we're now going into our growing season. So we've already seen them in the market in a very significant way. But don't confuse trade and sanctions. They are really different issues.
I didn't mean to confuse trade and sanctions so much as the impact. The allegation in Bolton's book is that you were saying if we overuse sanctions, we will lose our power abroad because states will find a way to evade them. And it's the same with trade, that if we overuse...
I don't think that's accurate. What I would say is, again, we have a responsibility because we are the reserve currency in how we use our sanctions. And we've used them a lot, but we have a responsibility. As it relates to trade, we don't have that responsibility because, again, we have the right to buy what we want to buy. Again, the president's whole trade strategy has been, we want free and fair trade. In the case of China, the reason why we have such a big trade deficit is for way too long of a period of time, both on Democrat and Republican administrations, the U.S. has been open to China and China has not been open to the U.S. So our real focus has been rebalancing that to have a fair and reciprocal trading relationship. And as I've said in the past, China has a vast growing middle class. If U.S. companies and U.S. workers have the ability to compete, that's a big opportunity for our business.
Yeah, the premise of the trade war is one thing, and the other is the tools that you have at your disposal. And in this case, the Trump administration has been criticized for overusing the tools at its disposal. China just found a different market. And that's the question that I was asking. Was that a concern for you as the debate was progressing? Were you worried that China would just move to Brazil and our soybean farmers would not be able to rebound?
Well, our farmers completely understand what we're doing. And again, tariffs are a very, very important tool. And there's no question the only reason why China was willing to sign the Phase 1 agreement was because of tariffs. They liked the status quo. So our farmers understand. And in the long run, this has been a great opportunity for them.
The last presidential election that we had, Trump ran a very populist campaign. A lot of his ads were castigating people like you, Goldman Sachs, bankers, Wall Street, fat cats, hedge fund managers. And now you've been one of his longest serving cabinet members. Looking back on your work, do you think, and in your time, the last 3.5 years with the Trump administration, do you think that the president will be able to run a similar campaign?
Well, I'm not going to comment on the president's campaign since I'm no longer involved in the campaign. When I was his finance chair, I could comment on those things. I think, as you know, I've known the president for 15 years before I came into politics. I traveled with him in the last campaign. It was the single best preparation for this job. We developed the economic programs together. And more importantly, I traveled the country, met with tens of thousands of business people, and understood why he was elected. And let me just comment, I was also a regional banker, and being a regional banker gives you tremendous understanding of the issues. And what we saw last time was the financing markets have been great for people, but for the average American, their pay hadn't gone up enough. And we're very proud of the economic programs we've put into effect. And had it not been for this virus, we had an incredible economy going that was helping everybody.
Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, thank you for being with us today.